Hopefully you had some success with the chunk problem. This is definitely a pretty challenging one, so if you ran into any issues, hey, don't sweat it. In this section, we're going to go through one possible solution to the chunk problem. Now there are two solutions that come to mind kind of easily when I think about this chunk problem. So we're going to look at one possible solution in this video, and then we'll look at another possible solution in the next one. Now I think that the difficulty between these two solutions are kind of equal in putting them together, but I think the second solution, so the one that we'll look at in a little bit, is probably more challenging to arrive at by yourself. So this is another great example of when you know the trick, things get easy, but if you don't know the trick, well, life is a little bit hard. Okay, so we're going to look at a diagram that is going to describe our first solution. So let's take a look at this. So we're going to walk through this series of steps right here. So this is our algorithm starting at the top and going down. And as we talk through this algorithm, we're also going to kind of trace out how all these different puzzle pieces are changing, or all these different arrays are changing over time. So this is going to be just a little bit awkward. Hopefully you can bear with me as I try to diagram or demonstrate this with some of these shapes. So let's get to it. First off, we're going to assume that our chunk function gets called with some array that has 3 elements inside of it. And so this green thing right here, this is the array that our function is going to be called with. We're also going to assume that we have a chunk size of 2, just for the purposes of walking through this example. So here's the algorithm we're going to use. We'll first start off by creating a brand new empty array to hold this kind of chunked version of our data. And we're going to call this thing chunked. So this is like the chunked version of our array. So we're going to represent this brand new array that you and I are going to create with this blue box right here. And so I will draw an arrow from that step to this blue box to just remind you, hey, this is the chunked version of our array. After creating this empty array, we will then start to iterate through the original unchunked array that was passed into our function. So the unchunked array is this original one right here up top in green. Then for each element in that unchunked array, we're going to go through a series of steps right here. First, we're going to retrieve the last element in the blue chunked array. So the last element, the element that's furthest to the right-hand side. Now the first time our algorithm runs, this brand new chunked array will be completely empty. So when we attempt to retrieve the last element inside of it, we will end up with essentially undefined. We'll have nothing to show for it. So the next line is how we handle that. We're going to look at that element that we just retrieved, the last element in the chunked array. We will say that if the last element does not exist, or if the last element inside the chunked array is equal to chunk size, then we'll execute this step right here. So we definitely fall into this if statement right here because the last element in our chunked array does not yet exist for the first time we run through this. So we're going to execute this line of code right here. And this line of code says that we are going to push a new subarray or a new chunk into the blue chunked one with the current element that we are iterating over, which is 1. So this is the for loop that we are iterating through right here. So we're going to take a new subarray, this kind of chunk right here, we're going to push it in, and then we're going to add our first element to it. And that concludes our first loop through this array. We now will iterate through this array again. So we're going to move on to element 2 right here. We will attempt to retrieve the last element in chunked. Now this time it's going to be this blue chunk that we return right here. So this is the last element in our chunked array. So this time we check to see if that last element does not exist. It does exist, so that's not satisfied. We then check to see if the length of that chunk is equal to our chunk size of 2. Well, at present, our chunk size is 1, so we don't fall into that case. So rather than executing this line of code, we'll go down to the else case right here. And the else case says add the current element, which is 2, into the chunk, the last element in the chunked array. So we're going to take 2 and add it in right there. Finally, we'll iterate through the last element inside of our unchunked array. So this is going to be the 3. We'll retrieve the last element in chunked. So that's going to be the purple block box right here. We check to see if its length is equal to the chunk size. And so now at this point in time, there are 2 elements inside of here, and we have a chunk size of 2. So we do satisfy the if statement right here, and we're going to run this line of code. So we're going to push a new chunk into chunked. So we're going to take this new chunk, shove it in there, and then we'll take the current element and put it inside that. And now we have nothing else to iterate through with our for loop. Our original loop right here is now empty. We've gone through everything, and we have ended up with our correctly chunked array right here. So this is it. This is pretty much how we're going to accomplish this first run through or this first solution. Now again, if you came up with a different solution than this one, that's totally fine, totally appropriate. This is just one possible solution, and one that I personally think is kind of straightforward and easy to understand, or at least relatively easy. So let's now take a break. We'll continue in the next section and start to code this solution up.